I'd like to turn it over to Norma, who will in turn introduce Nicolasa.
Okay, thank you, Linda, and good evening, everyone. Nicolasa Chavez, a 14th generation New Mexican, is a historian, curator, and performance artist whose work concentrates on the rich multicultural heritage of New Mexico and the connection between New Mexico and the Spanish-speaking world. Her exhibitions include New World Cuisine, The Histories of Chocolate, Mate y Mas, The Red That Colored the World, Flamenco from Spain to New Mexico, and Musica Buena, Hispano folk music of New Mexico. She is the author of The Spirit of Flamenco from Spain to New Mexico and A Century of Masters, the NEA National Heritage Fellows of New Mexico, which won a New Mexico Book Award. During her early years as a flamenco and Spanish dancer, she studied and performed flamenco and Spanish dance with, you'll probably recognize some of these names, Lily del Castillo, Pablo Rodarte, Eva Encina Sandoval, and Maria Benitez. She also studied and performed Argentine tango with Michael Walker and Julio Balmaceda. Her love of history led her to conduct research on flamenco in Spain. She performs and conducts lectures and demonstrations on the history of flamenco, Spanish dance, and Argentine tango. She has served as Deputy Historian of New Mexico and is now Curator of Latin American and New Mexican collections at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe. So Nicolasa, it is all yours.
All right. First, thank you everybody for showing up tonight. Valentine week, and we're talking about dance and music of passion. But we're going to get into the general history. I think one of the things that draws a lot of people to flamenco is that it expresses every human emotion. So sometimes people think of it as being sad and intense, but there's also moments of joy. And with this lecture, some of the names that were mentioned in my bio, they are included in this talk. I imagine many of you have seen some of these people perform and want to know a little bit more about them. But I always start with what is flamenco, where it came from, how it developed, and then, of course, how we get it in our neck of the woods. So I'm going to share my screen. So this lecture was based on the exhibition and the book that I'd written. And flamenco, of course, according to my bio, is very near and dear to my heart. I started at the age of 11 with Vicente Romero of Santa Fe, who we will learn about and talk about in the presentation. But it was a dream of mine to be able to do an exhibit on flamenco. And the book itself is called The Spirit of Flamenco. And I think this is the one thing that really draws a lot of us to it, that have seen performances. There is something that we refer to in the flamenco community as duende, which was a term coined by the writer and poet, playwright Federico Garcia Lorca. And duende is that kind of soul from within, that when you're in the moment of flamenco, there's this energy. And I kind of think of it as a Zen energy in a way too, because all space and time is forgotten, and it's the music, the dance, that community celebration of coming together. And flamenco itself, one of the reasons I did it at the Museum of International Folk Art is it is a traditional folkloric form. So many people, their only chance seeing flamenco is on stage, and you'll get a feel of that. But flamenco happens at family gatherings, it happens at weddings, it happens at baptismals, it happens at parties. It happens over the holidays. There's songs just for the holidays, and people will dance all night. Flamenco is very similar to jazz, as you'll see in this picture. People are surrounded in a circle in celebration, but it's very much like a jam session. And usually you'll have people show up with guitars, you have various people that know how to sing, and then various people that take turns coming into the center of the circle to dance. Other art forms I think of are hip hop, where when you're breakdancing, there's a circle around you, cheering you on and clapping to the music as you go out and do your moves, and then you leave, somebody else hops into the circle and does their moves. So Flamenco is improvisational. Okay, I am sorry about the preview on the slide, but this is how we have to do it because for some reason my computer's freezing. But flamenco is one of these things, these types of music and song and dance that's handed down generation to generation in the family. And in particular, I really love this picture because it shows the young girl obviously learning to improvise her moves while either a father, a grandfather, or uncle is singing to her. And of course, there's lookers on. The little boy in the back looks a little bored, like he's like, oh no, now I'm gonna have to go next or something. But it's something, there's a phrase in the flamenco world that the first sounds of flamenco happen when you're in your mother's belly, or when you're a baby and you hear nana, which is like a lullaby. A nana is a lullaby in flamenco. So people grow up doing flamenco. The Gitanos, or the Gypsies of Spain, have been credited with really creating and developing flamenco, but we know it has ancient historic roots as well. There were many traditions on the Iberian Peninsula. You had 800 years of Arabic rule. Before that, you had the Visigoths in Spain, you had the Celts, you had Sephardic Jews in Spain. You had all of these musical influences coming together. And of course, when the Gitanos come into Spain, they kind of take all of this and adopt it into their own form. And I don't know how many people out there have seen the movie La Chaudron, which traces gypsies throughout Europe. It starts in Egypt, India, and goes all the way through Europe. And the music is different in each country that they go, but very musical people. So in Spain, it's very unique to the Iberian Peninsula, what you end up hearing. Flamenco didn't really develop into an art form until about the second half of the 19th century, and pretty much towards the end, the last quarter, is when you really started getting flamenco as a performance art. This is a really famous picture from 1880 of one of the largest and top cafés cantantes in Sevilla, Spain. So it's translates in English as singing cafe, but up until this time, they were kind of variety show. There was another form of Spanish dance called Escuela Bolera, which originated in Spanish court dancing. It's like a combination of leaps from ballet, but with castanets and the high Spanish carriage. So instead of arms being here, way up here with the movement, when flamenco comes in, it starts to replace the Escuela Bolera as the main act of the night. There were also circus acts involved. So you think of all these different musical acts all night. The flamencos and the gitanos were saved for the grand finale at the end. And there's many different accounts by travel writers, journalists, historians documenting these cafes. And once the show ended, sometimes there would be what is called a huerga, or a jam session, or a party that would go into the wee hours of the morning. Spaniards in general love to stay up all night, stay out really late. Music is always involved, as are tapas and drinks, of course. So these cafés cantantes were a wonderful way for these artists to finally get paid for the first time for their art. So a singer can get hired, for a certain number of nights. From these gigs, you would also get invited into a wealthy home to play for a party. So musicians are starting to make their living at something that was their traditional art form, very much in the way New Mexican santeros now can work full-time as an artist, whereas before it was something that was done for the community or in the home. Flamenco is now a performance art. Of course, by the beginning of the 20th century, it develops, this is just not helping me here. My keyboard's what's freezing. It starts developing into more what we'd consider fine art, high art, avant-garde art. Flamenco really sees this huge push at the beginning of the 20th century, roughly right around the time of World War I and into the 1920s. And there was a development called opera flamenca, a style of flamenco that was very operatic. At the same time, jazz is coming in, showgirls and different types of dances from France, cabaret acts, and many felt that the Gitano way of life and the flamenco tradition was dying. It kind of parallels the tradition of revival arts in the US, where we see this resurgence in bringing back traditional arts, which of course, goes into the 30s here under the WPA and that sort of thing. But two of the big proponents were the classical composer Manuel de Falla and also the playwright Federico Garcia Lorca. And several women became very prominent and at the forefront of this movement to preserve the traditional art of flamenco and classical Spanish dance. And in this photo, you'll see two women. The one in the middle was a famous singer and dancer, Pastora Imperio. And her mother was known for being a singer, and she is of Gitana descent. With her is Escudero, who was a very famous male dancer, considered avant-garde at that time, and the dancer La Argentina, who not only danced, but ran her own professional company. She choreographed and directed and produced many of her own shows, and she collaborated with Lorca on stuff. She had Salvador Dali, Pablo Picasso, Nestor de la Torre, the top artists of the day would design her sets and the costumes for her shows. And a big part of this movement too is getting flamenco and Spanish dance out into the rest of the world. So the picture on the left is Leonid Massin of the Ballet Russe with Manuel de Falla. And during World War I, the Ballet Russe left France and had a residency in Spain. They stayed in Spain for part of the war. Spain, of course, was neutral and didn't take part in World War I. And they were able to choreograph and work on several ballet numbers inspired by the Alhambra in Spain. So this is a picture of the two in the Patio de los Leones at the Alhambra in Granada, Spain. Here's another fabulous picture of La Argentina, and then one of the wonderful set designs. And you'll see these very modernist, cubist type flamenco dresses and costumes on them. These were all designed by the artist Nestor de la Torre, who did this set design for her. This particular number or show was called Triana, and it was a flamenco dance drama about the barrio or neighborhood of Triana in Sevilla, which once upon a time was its own separate city across the river from Sevilla, and it was largely heavily populated by Gitanos, and also it was the ceramic center where a lot of your azulejo and tiles and pottery was made. Of course, Triana now is a neighborhood of Sevilla, but she did a whole production about it, the street life and the people there. And this was done about 1929. And this is a fun one. Some wonderful pieces that I was thrilled to get in to the exhibit at the museum at the time, original Pablo Picasso sketches. He did costume sketches and set design. And this was his set design for a 1919 production called El Sombrero de Tres Picos, or Le Tricorne, which debuted in Paris before it debuted in Spain. But this was one of his drawings. This collection is actually at the McNay Museum in San Antonio. And some other famous women at the forefront again that really are influential in bringing flamenco to the U.S. La Argentina also came to the U.S. There was another one roughly just a few years after her called La Argentinita. Neither of them are related, but they were born, both of them were born of Spanish parents in Argentina and got their early development in flamenco and Spanish dance while living in Argentina. And when they come back to Spain, as is custom, a lot of dancers, musicians, artists have nicknames. So Encarnacion Lopez y Julves is her first name, but she's extremely important because she ends up discovering one of our most famous dancers in the US and setting him on his career. And he is the one that we'll get to later that makes flamenco a household name in the United States. But she did several residencies in New York. She's in the black and white photo. But what predates her is Carmen Dauset Moreno, or as she is known, Carmencita, who had come to New York in the 1880s and 1890s, more of a classical Spanish dancer. But this was one of the big times where you first started getting a lot of dance coming in on tours. And there was this phenomenon roughly at the end of the 19th century that lasted into the 20s called the Spanish craze. And it coincided with the Spanish-American War in 1898. But all things Spanish, music, poetry, theater, dance, art, was very popular. It was all the rage at the time. And you see this in paintings. You see American painters going to Spain to paint. John Singer Sargent is one, very recognizable and famous for his one flamenco dancer, the painting El Jaleo. This one is at the Brooklyn Museum of Carmencita. And if anybody has visited the Hispanic Society in New York, that whole collection of artwork, the works of Joaquin Sorolla, again, a Spaniard coming over to New York in the US. And of course, Albeniz, Isaac Albeniz, and all these composers were here working in the US. So Argentinita comes over and collaborates with a lot of them. But Carmen Dowsett became so famous that it was said many a rich, wealthy housewife in New York hired her for private lessons because they wanted to move like her to entice their husbands. And it was also said the skirt length started going up a little bit based on costumes that she wore. So she created this kind of rage and fashion and sensuality and behavior that you weren't supposed to normally do in public, right? But you could do it while you were dancing. As we fast forward, one of our most famous women is Carmen Amaya, who comes a lot later, but she follows that trajectory of La Argentina and La Argentinita in that she was traveling around the world. She's from a gypsy family from the Barcelona area up in Catalonia, so very different. Most of the families are concentrated in Andalusia, but she is down in Argentina on tour in Buenos Aires. And her family flees the dictatorship, Spanish Civil War, and Francisco Franco wins the war. So she and her whole entourage, she was known to travel with a minimum of 20 family members along with her dance company. Many family members were in her company, but she was so successful down in Buenos Aires, she was going to buy property and stay there. But there was an impresario, Saul Hurak, who was down there and noticed her, discovered her, talked her into coming up to New York and doing a residency up in New York. She debuted at the Beachcomber in the mid-40s, either 1942 or 45, right around there. But right away, an instant sensation. And then from there, she began appearing in Hollywood movies. First as just a background character in one movie called For the Boys. There's a scene where the Navy dancers come in to a Spanish-looking restaurant with senoritas there, and there's a whole song about the good neighbor policy. And that's her first appearance, but she's not doing flamenco in it yet. But then she goes from that background character into starring and being herself in 17 different Hollywood movies. So again, getting flamenco out there. She was the queen of the gypsies, was her nickname, La Reina de los Gitanos. That's how she was referred. There's a huge collection at the New York Public Library for Performing Arts and the Library and Archives there. Just files and files on Carmen Amaya and all the shows and residencies and everything she's done in the US contributing to flamenco here. And now we're going to get into probably one of the most famous people that most people recognize right away. I can't see everybody's faces on the screen, but I'm betting a lot of you remember Jose Greco or have seen him on tour at some point. He's the one, when I was talking about Encarnacion Lopez, La Argentinita, he grew up, funny thing about him is for years back then, everybody thought he was a pure-blooded Spanish gypsy, but really he was a young Italian boy from Brooklyn. But he had everybody fooled for a really long time. That was part of the romanticism and the persona that he portrayed. His company was always Jose Greco and his gypsies, or Isus Gitanos. So when you would see a show, you knew you were getting actual Gitanos from Spain. But what happened as a young boy, he didn't think to become a dancer right away. His sister was studying dance, but his parents very smartly, to keep him out of trouble and keep him off, hanging out with other boys and being on the streets all the time and causing a ruckus. His father was a baker in Brooklyn. They made him escort his sister to all her dance classes. And lo and behold, he picks it up really quickly. He's got a natural talent for it. He falls in love with it. And the sister ends up singing for the Metropolitan Opera. So she has her talent in other spheres. But he, in one of the newspaper articles, he's quoted as saying, I would do everything from the cha-cha-cha to the Susie Q. And he got work dancing at all these different nightclubs in New York, teaching lessons in Latin dance, the whole thing. And La Argentinita is there on tour and sees this young man dancing and sees the natural gifts he has, and on the spot invites him to join her company and go on tour with her. Within a year, he's her leading man and partner in her dance company. This was roughly 1945. She died 3 years later in 1948, very young. She was in her late 30s, early 40s, cardiac arrest. But her sister Pilar Lopez takes over the company. So Jose Greco stays on tour with the Pilar Lopez company, and then he pretty much moves over to Spain. Anybody who's studying flamenco and Spanish dance at the time, that's where you went to really focus and learn directly from the source. And a lot of Americanos are traveling over there to get the culture and the heritage and all of this. So he goes over, extremely talented, then comes back and sets up his own company, and he's handpicked his company of dancers from his time in Spain. So he is bringing Spanish dancers over with him. And this is when he starts touring all over the US and around the world. And many of our US dancers who are really well known and big, get their own fame and their own companies, get a start with him. And that includes New Mexico's very own Vicente Romero, which we'll get into in a little bit. And there was another dancer out of Phoenix, Arizona, Lidia Torrea, who has set up a whole, tradition of dancing in Arizona and has students now with their own companies. But she is half Spanish, half Polish, grew up in the US, but had always gone back to Spain to visit family, and fell in love with Spanish dance and told her parents that's what she wanted to do. They said, you have to graduate high school first. So she graduated 2 years early, then hightailed it to Spain, which is where he discovered her. He's discovered many leading ladies. This was his first wife, Lola de Ronda, who danced with him. This beautiful image is from about 1950 to 51. And this is a classical piece. So when I was talking about Escuela Bolera and classical dance, you're in a soft slipper, very much like ballet, but you see the Spanish carriage, and she has the castanets with her. So during this time period, the real important thing that Spanish dance companies did is they would do all the regional dances from Spain. You'd see Escuela Bolera. You'd see dance to classical music. You would see Jota Aragonesa, which is a folk dance. Again, one of the more famous dances out of Spain. Really high leaps, castanets, totally different costumes than flamenco. So this is a very beautiful classical piece that they do together in their shows. So he was a well-rounded dancer who could do all these different dances. In the tradition, flamenco was the encore, the grand finale at the end, and the encore. So flamenco was always saved for the last to really wow everybody all of a sudden with footwork and this and that. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. So we're going to get into, again, the traditional art forms. So both of these veins are how flamenco starts coming into New Mexico. Many a New Mexican remember seeing a tour, or let me see if I can shut the door. Somebody's walking by and they're barking. Okay. I have to leave the door cracked, although bark to go out. So the ferias and the traditional side of flamenco, that's not the performance art, is happening all this time. So as it's growing and becoming a theater art and people are touring, you still have local ferias and fiestas in Spain. These pictures are from the Feria de Abril in Sevilla, the April Fair, as it translates in English. It's the largest fair in all of Andalusia, and it kicks off a whole spring and summer season. And I call it a second holiday season in Spain. Like we have, Christmas and Hanukkah and our big season here in the US where we have lights everywhere and holiday all over the place, right? Once Holy Week and Lent are over in Spain, all of a sudden the towns just go crazy in the spring with all these spring festivities. And the women and the men dress up in local regional costume. You'll see the men in horse gear, dressed to ride their horses and carriages, and the women on the back. And it's called Vestirse de Gitana when you come out to the feria. It makes me think very much of early pictures you would see of Santa Fe Fiesta, where people would really dress up for the fiesta here and wear fiesta skirts, wear Spanish shawls. You didn't go out of the house unless you got dressed up. So at these ferias, the dancing that I was talking about, where it's family and community, takes place all night long and all generations. So here you'll see the grandparents, their children, and then the grandchildren in this picture. And I was invited into this wonderful caseta, as they're called. They're large. It's like a wedding tent, like when you're renting a tent for an outdoor party, but there's hundreds and hundreds of them, and different families own them. And during the feria, they get them totally decked out, decorated. They all have bars with food, tapas, and drinks. You can see the tables in the back, but there's always this big area for dancing and listening to music and celebrating all night long. And these ferias go into the wee hours, the middle of the night. I had gone in college for a semester over to Sevilla, also to study flamenco, and I wrote my first semester senior project on flamenco history, which kind of is what instigated where we are today with this lecture. But way back then, I was taken out. My friends would dress me up, and we'd go out, and you'd be out there until sunrise, all night until sunrise, and then you go sleep till maybe noon, get up, shower, eat something, and then right around 4 o'clock in the afternoon is when all the horse carriages come out. So por la tarde, the late afternoon in Spain, is the Fiesta del Caballo. The streets just have all these people in their pageantry. Then the horses retire at about dark, and you have the streets full of people singing and dancing, visiting all night long. And it goes on for about a week. And if you're in Andalusia, Spain, you can start in Sevilla. It's always exactly 2 weeks after Easter. And then the next city will have theirs, and then the next city and the next city. So you could literally stay there for months, hitting a different feria in a different town nonstop. It will wear you out though. So I recommend taking breaks in between. Okay, let's see if I can get my screen to go down further. Here we go. Yeah, it's like I keep losing the mouse. So this would be an early, beautiful picture from 1919 in New Mexico. And I do think it's one of the ways we very easily adopted flamenco and Spanish dance as being one of our own traditions. We know flamenco, sometimes people think it came up with the conquistadores and the first colonizers coming up. Flamenco didn't exist at that time. There was other Spanish dance, there was Baroque music, folk music, of course, and different traditions. But flamenco, as we noted, developed more. It has these ancient traditions, but the way we know it today developed more in the 19th century. So by 1919, here's a group of dancers, there's a piano. So that tells me they're probably doing classical dance, not actual flamenco. And when I interviewed a lot of New Mexico's flamencos, they do talk a lot about that flamenco, the real kind of pure Gitano flamenco, didn't really come till later. So it was Spanish dance, classical dance, or what people call aflamencado style. And these are some more early pictures from the Santa Fe fiestas here. On the left is my great aunt Nora Chavez with her twin Romualdo Chavez, and they would sing and dance and perform with a group of people at the Santa Fe fiesta. This picture dates to about 1939. And again, it was a very big deal at the time. We don't think of it the same way now. For families, for a lot of people, we still celebrate. But there used to be an actual music publication, New Mexico Music, and they would do a special fiesta edition. This one is from 1947, and this dancer is Elizabeth Serna Cardenas, who was a native of Santa Fe. And she went on to study ballet with the San Francisco Ballet, and then also studied Spanish dance, not only here, but when she went out to the Bay Area, the Encino family, or Cancino family, sorry, members of the Cancino family were teaching Spanish dance out there. that family is most famous for one member, and that's Rita Hayworth. She was a Cancino, but changed her name for Hollywood movies, of course. But her background was Spanish dance and music. The family were vaudeville performers. Of course, they left Spain after the Spanish Civil War and came over here during the Franco dictatorship, as did many Spanish expats during that time. So you're getting a big movement of Spaniards moving to the US and then setting up schools where you can learn the music, you can learn the dance. Of course, Carmen Amaya and her entourage are here. And my own father remembers seeing her as a child. My grandfather took him out in LA, where she was basically performing at a fundraiser for one of the local churches there under a tent in a parking lot. And this is the same woman who at that very same time could sell out the Hollywood Bowl. So she would still go out and be amongst the people and do stuff like that. So the community was very warm that way. They'd get these huge performance gigs in huge arenas, but local communities, we're all Spanish speakers, you're our primos, whatever, we're going to come perform in your parking lot, basically. So Betty, as Elizabeth Serna went for short, was out in San Francisco at this time studying Spanish dance and music, and she becomes a fiesta queen when she comes back in 47 and danced up a storm. She married, and it was, I think by the time she had her third child is when she finally stopped dancing and teaching. It was a little bit too much, but she kept her entire archive of magazines, revistas, photos, costumes, everything, which we were able to put on display in the exhibit. Her daughter's still alive today, so we still keep in touch. This is one of my favorite pictures. I think it's the closest we can get to what maybe trying to get that feel of what fiestas used to be like in New Mexico before, like now they close the plaza, everything's over by 10 o'clock and you have to leave, but there used to be dancing on top of the La Fonda Hotel. And I should say a side note, I'm showing pictures of Santa Fe Fiesta, but each town in New Mexico has a fiesta. Albuquerque Fiestas is in April. Española has a fiesta in July. Taos, I think, is July. Las Vegas is always 4th of July weekend. Deming, TRC, you go all over the state. Different towns have their fiestas and local fairs. The music and dance is still a part of it, but going all night and dancing on rooftops is not. But this is akin to me of when you're in Spain and that music is going all night long and it's joyful celebration and people dancing. And here you see this combo because this is also the same time when Mexican mariachi becomes very popular in New Mexico. And again, we adopted it, becomes one of our traditions as well. After all, these are our first cousins. We trace our family histories far enough back. We know we're all related and cousins. So flamenco and mariachi are very much a part of most local fiestas and celebrations today in New Mexico. And this is another wonderful picture. This is one of my teachers that I started with when I was 16, Lily del Castillo. And many of you might have seen her flamenco dance drama, Revelaciones, which told the tale of a woman in Spain who comes home from her parents' funeral to discover that she's a Sephardic Jew. And she leaves for the New World to escape the Inquisition. So this was done back in the early 90s. She debuted it at the Chemo Theater and also performed it out at the old church in Corrales. And then it went on tour. But this is her as a young girl dancing, as she called it, a flamencado style. Again, she said it wasn't exactly flamenco. It was kind of on the plaza, Old Town, Albuquerque. And this one's roughly from the 50s. Yes, this one's 1958. Very soon after that, she gets discovered by Vicente Romero, who encourages her and says, I will teach you actual dance, actual flamenco dance. This is another fabulous picture. I'm kind of flip-flopping here from fiestas, but flamenco and Spanish dance and Mexican dancing, all of our local traditions. This is also the time at the height of tourism in New Mexico where we're really promoting that tricultural history or tricultural myth, as we call it today, because we really know that there's not, we say there's the native culture, the Hispanic culture, and the Anglo, but we really know within all of those, there's a multitude of cultures. There's so many different Hispano cultures within that umbrella term. Just like Native American, there's, 18 Pueblos. There's not one culture. And then there's Apache and Comanche and all these non-Puebloan people in New Mexico. But this picture kind of says it all. This is from 1947. Betty Serna Cárdenas again, performing and doing this photo shoot for officers of the USO as they came through New Mexico. And I find it such this really wonderful mishmash because they have put a hat in the middle, symbolizing the Mexican hat dance, even though she's not doing Mexican dance, she's doing Spanish dance. And even then, Mexican hat dance comes from one part of Mexico. There's different dances all over that country. But the guy, too, playing guitar, we're not sure if he's actually playing flamenco or mariachi or maybe a bolero, but he's wearing the classic serape. But I thought it was just a really fun picture that kind of how New Mexico gets represented, right? When we have fiestas and especially balloon fiesta time, like our chile ristas, it's chili season, our local culture gets highlighted. And so this picture for me is kind of classic for that. I'm going to go like this and see if I can. Okay, here we go. So you've heard me mention Vicente Romero, and many of you have been in New Mexico for a long time, might have seen him when he had his nightly gig at El Nido in Tesuque. He actually made that a famous flamenco destination within the United States. And Vicente credits being discovered by none other than Jose Greco. There's several American men that Jose Greco sees dancing, discovers them, and says, you need to get to Spain if you're really serious. And Vicente had this way with getting wealthy women who love the arts to pay his way and kind of give him a scholarship. He went over to Spain. One of them was the actress Greer Garson, who funded many of his trips and development. But he went to Spain with an introductory letter by Jose Greco. He joined Pilar Lopez's company while there, just like Greco. He came back, he was on tour. He got really sick when he was in New York and decided to come home to New Mexico and not tour around so much, but he dedicated the next years to taking flamenco all over the state and really introducing people to what flamenco gitano was. So not classical dance, but just solid, strict flamenco dance and music done the traditional way. And a lot of people that were doing the aflamencado style of dance ended up dancing and joining Vicente's companies. So on the left, you see this beautiful black and white picture of him from 1957. It's very dapper. By the time he's back in New Mexico and sets up this nightly club out in Tesuque, and the brains behind this, he realizes, he's got a wonderful audience because the Santa Fe Opera is up there. And he schedules all of his shows to be late night tablaos. A tablao is basically a flamenco club named after the wood floor that you're dancing on, but food and drinks. So a lot of people would come for the summer to see opera and then go over to get flamenco with Vicente. And you hear all these accounts from back then where people would be like, it was just like being in Spain. There were real gitanos in the show, that sort of thing. But also for musicians and dancers, many a guitarist would travel out from the East Coast and just hunkered down in Santa Fe for the summer so they could learn flamenco firsthand from all the gitanos that were coming. And after the show, it was said again, all night jam sessions where musicians could really play back and forth. But what's beautiful, the colored picture that you see on the right is from 1970. So Vicente started El Nido roughly in 65. But the woman in white, the one many of us know, Maria Benitez, a very young Maria Benitez, when she first comes back from Spain, she had gone over for about 5 years to strictly study Spanish dance and really solidify it and perform. She met her husband, Cecilio Benitez, while in Spain, but that's her in the picture. Another wonderful dancer, Carla Duran, and Vicente's brother, Miguel Romero, who is still alive today. But that's his troupe. And the next slide are some of the show programs that were around at the time. So El Nido's Patio Flamenco, as it was called, And it was known for having this big tree. It was the flamenco room. The walls were painted behind to look like old Goya paintings, like at the Prado. And then Zozobra got added in at some point. But this went on for years. And then Vicente, also at La Fonda, they start doing flamenco and bringing in flamenco again, largely for a tourist audience, but New Mexicans were enjoying this stuff too. Some classic shots of Maria and Vicente together and how dynamic they were together. Excellent pairing. People always talked about them being the perfect dance couple, fiery, emotional, connecting on stage. Of course, like all dance couples, at some point they break up. Vicente goes on his own, Maria as well. When I interviewed Maria, she credits her husband in many ways with her breaking free and doing it on her own, because her husband said, "You're this amazing, strong dancer. You can carry a show all by yourself." And Vicente went off to set up a new nightclub called Sambra, which is now El Gancho today, and do a flamenco club out there. He named it after the Gypsy Caves in Spain and the song, the Sambra, which has a very Arabic feel to it when you hear it. The rhythm, sometimes it's dance with zills and finger cymbals and that sort of thing. So he moves on. Maria takes over El Nido in Tesuque, and many people continue along in her company. And she continues bringing in guitarists and dancers and singers from Spain, as you see in this bottom picture. Here's another really fun one. Maria, of course, everything's fire, passion, intensity, but she had this playful side. She loved doing comedy as well and fun routines. And we don't always remember her the way you see her on the left. This is what is called a guajira. It's a type of song that's called ida y vuelta, or round trip. And it's basically flamenco music that was influenced by the sounds of the Caribbean at the end of the 19th century, before the Spanish-American War. And, last of the Spanish territories are gone from Spain. But the music infuses, and the guajira is very flirty. It's very beautiful and lyrical and flowy. It talks about the beaches in Cuba and smoking cigars and a lot of love, a lot of heat and sensuality. So I really love this picture of her performing. And I did not write down the name of her partner in my notes. I should have. This again is Lily del Castillo, who I showed before on Old Town Plaza. And she starts with Vicente. And while with Vicente, she meets her husband, Luis Campos, who's in the picture on the right. That's a gorgeous shot of both of them that was featured in the Albuquerque Journal one year. And again, this is her showing the very playful side of rumba flamenca, which is a party dance. This is what the Gypsy Kings have made famous. They do flamenco rumbas. They don't do other types of flamenco, but rumba, which is what gets you up on the floor, and again, jamming, people singing lyrics. I just love it because it expresses joy. And sometimes, again, we don't always remember that part. I can't play right now, honey. This is Albuquerque we'll move into. I'm looking at my clock here. So Jose Greco, of course, would go on tour around the country, and everywhere he went, flamenco communities would greet him. But I love this picture because it's a little Spanish dance group called the Tiny Senoritas. And one of those dancers is alive today, and Lily danced with them as well. But in that group of dancers, they represented the Latino culture at the grand reopening of It's a Small World in Disneyland in 1960s. It's a Small World underwent renovations and remodeling. So they invited different people from all over the country to represent different cultures in It's a Small World. So the Tiny Senoritas went out there and represented Spain and Hispano culture. When Jose Greco came to Albuquerque, they had this huge reception for him. So it's just such a touching picture that I really love, like those behind the scenes type of things that, affect somebody's decision to go into dance or not for the rest of their life. On your right is Eva Encinia Sandoval, of course, the brainchild and woman behind the entire flamenco program at UNM. She proposed that as a dance student while at UNM. She was doing modern dance. but she grew up in a family well-versed in Spanish cante, flamenco music, singing. Her mother was a singer, and she studied with another man named Teo Morca, who also got discovered by Jose Greco and also danced with Pilar Lopez. So she's getting early flamenco training and classical training while being a dance student at UNM, and she convinces the university to start including flamenco as one of the dances you can take and learn. And of course, today, fast forward to now, we are the only university in the entire nation where you can actually get a graduate degree in dance with a flamenco concentration. And she's also largely responsible for the Festival de Albuquerque, which happens every June. It's about 8 or 9 nights in a row now of the top flamenco companies from Spain. When it started out, she started bringing in all the local New Mexicans and people from California, Seattle, Washington, some of the flamencos around the nation. And she would usually bring in one Spaniard from Spain that would headline and be the big guest star. Well, that's grown into what it is today. This is a picture of one of the early workshops with her son, Joaquin, who now heads up and directs Hijastros, the American Repertory Flamenco Company. This is Eva dancing at the festival in the 1990s, again, with a fantastic costume made by another, a Mexican-American dancer who grew up in Denver, Pablo Rodarte, who went to Spain to become a flamenco dancer, and he stayed for 20 plus years. Full-time dance in Spain, professional, also learned costume design while there. And he came back from Spain and was hired at UNM for about, I think, a 5-year tenure there. I happened to be at UNM and got to take from both of them, which was just wonderful at the time. But Pablo designed that dress out of an antique Manton de Manila for her, and still remember today. This is an image of Pablo at one of the early festivals. So both of these pictures are circa 1991. I'm going back a ways again. And also at the festival, Eva would bring back, this is Jose Greco at about age 80. She invited him back to the festival along with his son, Pepe, which is Jose Dos, who is now, this amazing star of flamenco and Spanish dance and has his own companies. But at that time, he was in his 20s and they all came out and taught classes. And basically the festival, you have a week-long shows every night, but there's also 8 hours of class every day going on, multiple classes at the same time, every level from basic beginning to professional level, people who want to just get an introduction to flamenco, people who are trying to learn an advanced choreography because such and such teachers in town and you want to take from them. So it's a really big deal, especially for many students who can't always just up and travel to Spain, that these people come here to teach us and we get to learn directly from the source. It is absolutely amazing. And the tradition, flamenco is not just in New Mexico, of course, it is around the world. There's a huge community in Japan, and I love these two images because I was able to get both of these pieces when I did the exhibit, and they are in my book. But I was over in Japan presenting New Mexican history and New Mexican arts and cultures at a UNESCO World Heritage Conference. And after flying what seemed like days in the air and getting from Tokyo to Komatsu and then on a bus to Kanazawa, I finally enter my hotel. It's like 2 days ahead of when I left, and it's midnight Japan time. And there's a poster in the lobby of this beautiful image of this dancer. And I'm going, who is this? What is this? And my local contact there in Kanazawa said, oh my gosh, it's a Japanese painter who traveled through Spain painting flamenco dancers. And there's an exhibit up right now at the Kanazawa Museum of Art. So we went over there, saw the exhibit, contacted the curator, and we were able to get in touch. The artist had died, but his wife was alive still and lent that painting to the exhibit at the Folk Art Museum. And I just love how just these things have fallen into place. And then I also knew that many Spanish guitarists and dancers will tour Tokyo or go over there for 6 months and have nonstop work and then come back to Spain and work. So a friend of mine who I'd met when he was in New Mexico playing for Maria Benitez. I went to Japan all the time. And when I knew I was going, I wrote him, can you put me in touch with some flamenco dancers in Tokyo? And the friend he put me in touch with was away at the time, but she says, but you want to meet this man, Haruko Okohama, because he's the most amazing fashion designer. He does flamenco costumes. He's a dancer. He does no theater. So this is Haruko in what is called a bata de cola, which is the long train made out of recycled wedding kimono and in a no theater mask, doing very avant-garde. So it's like full circle from when we saw those early Picasso and Nestor de la Torre, Cubist costumes in the 1920s and the teens. And here we have the 2000 and teens. Haruko's costume, what's the year? Yes, 2013 is when that picture was taken and when he did that costume. So I really like to include that because there are flamenco communities in many places. Huge one in Mexico City, of course, New York, LA, the Bay Area, Seattle. There's dancers everywhere that continue to share the tradition, and there's dance schools where you can learn, but they all bring in your guest teachers. And this is the other man I mentioned, Teo Morca, who grew up in Los Angeles. And again, he was in a music appreciation class. And as the way he says it is he was on his way to become an auto mechanic. He was in school and learning auto mechanics stuff and technique, but he took music appreciation because he loves classical music. Well, his homework assignment was to go to this concert. He ended up at the wrong theater and ended up at a flamenco show watching Jose Greco. And that's it. This is what I'm doing. And his entire life and career was flamenco, Spanish dance. Fabulous teacher. He's the one that I said Eva had taken from very early on. And her very first flamenco festivals, she'd bring him in as her guest artist. And another fun New Mexico connection, he was in Spain studying at the same time as Maria Benitez. And she would go back and forth a bit, and she had a summer residency in Taos, which is where she grew up, Taos Pueblo. Well, she wanted to stay in Spain longer and study more. So Teo goes to Taos and fills in for her and actually lives on the Pueblo and does a nightly flamenco show at La Fonda on the plaza in Taos. Back again, this is back in the 60s. Fast forward to the 80s, he's here during all of our flamenco festivales. And he ends up making Taos his final home before he passed away, and was teaching summer intensives. And just some of the traditions continuing. Luis and Lily del Castillo again, a more contemporary image. This is roughly the beginning of the 2000s. And some of the international people that have come to New Mexico and stayed. In this image, you'll see Chusco playing guitar in the back and Mina Fajardo. Chusco is of Gypsy heritage, Gitano family from Granada, Spain. They owned one of the caves of the Sacromonte, and he grew up as a little child dancing and learning guitar. But he ended up in New Mexico. He was playing for Maria Benitez, came over in about 1988. And every summer season, he was her lead guitarist, and then would get hired to play at the festival every year in Albuquerque. And while on tour in New York, he met Mina Fajardo, who was originally from Tokyo, but she went to New York and started studying flamenco in New York. And they've made their home in Santa Fe and have their own company here and have played and toured for years. And they have a regular teaching residency in Española. She works with Moving Arts and with the community college up there. And there's a whole huge group of young dancers learning from Mina. And this is my daughter on the left with a friend of hers from school. My daughter is now about to turn 23. But when this picture was taken, they were learning with Maria's National Institute of Flamenco. No, Institute for Spanish Arts is what hers was called. And La Emi, who is now very famous and has her own company and who was a student of Maria's, was teaching all these young girls at the time. So they kept that tradition alive, performing on the Santa Fe Plaza, not only during fiestas, but something I love about Santa Fe is 4th of July celebrations. You'll have your usual 4th of July fanfare, but there's usually a lowrider and antique car show. there's going to be mariachi on the plaza at some point that day and flamenco, along with all your regular marches and standard songs you hear on the 4th of July. But that's the beauty of New Mexico to me, is this mix we get. And, very proud of being Americans, but also proud of our local heritage and what it really means. And I leave us, I don't know if this is my last slide. Yes, I leave us with this beautiful image of Maria Benitez. Many of you might have read or heard. She passed away this summer. In a way, for many of us, heartbreaking end of an era. But because of her, there's this new era of dancers and company members today that are going strong, just like in Albuquerque. There's a whole slew. You have the National Institute of Flamenco, you have Tierra Adentro, which is the charter school, and the Public Academy for Performing Arts in Albuquerque, where young kids are learning from teachers that learned with Maria, or learned with Eva, or learned with Lily del Castillo. I'm a product of that. This lecture that you're hearing tonight is a product of all these people that have come before us. And with that, I end my talk. And I will stop sharing and go back to main screen.
Thank you very much, Nicolasa. If anyone has a question or
I
comment.
have a question. I have a question.
Excuse me, can you put it in the chat box?
Okay, sure. Okay.
Thank you. It'll be easier for us to look at those and then pass them along to Nicolasa rather than trying to figure out who's talking on the screen. Okay, well, the first comment is bravo.
Thank you.
The next question is, do you know specific Jewish elements in flamenco?
Yes, one of the most common ones we hear, there's a lot of studies going on now. We do know Jewish music. We also know African music. All these traditions come in and really influence flamenco. But the one song form that really harkens back to Sephardic music is the siguria, which is one of the oldest, I don't want to use the word melody, but in flamenco, there's different rhythms and different melodies that go with them. And there are some called cante hondo, which is flamenco deep song. And then I had mentioned ida y vuelta in the lecture, which is infused with Caribbean sound. And we have cante chico, which are different forms. So cante hondo, flamenco deep song, is made up of the oldest of the flamenco songs and traditions. One of those is siguria. The influences and origins go back to the medieval era and also that 800 years of Arabic rule in Spain. But that's the one that most ethnomusicologists agree and trace to Sephardic Jewish music.
Okay. Sarah, do you want to do the next one?
Sure. The next question is, any connection between Argentinian tango and Spanish flamenco? And as a follow-up to that, why is there so much yelling during flamenco performances?
Oh, wonderful. You're the first one, you're yelling to cheer on everybody. It's participatory, very much in the same way, like I mentioned breakdancing earlier, when somebody's out spinning in the middle of the floor and everybody's hollering, "That's it, you go, right on," or "You've got it." So it's kind of the same thing with flamenco. Ole actually comes from Allah. It's meaning you are channeling the heavens or God, or you have that spirit in you. So ole, or you'll hear con ole, with ole sometimes, which in the US we're like, con ole, what does that mean? So that side of it, haleo, is really important. Obviously, if the song is super serious and there's a real quiet part, like say the siguria that I mentioned, where the singer is just really intense and the dance is intense, obviously you're not going to be hollering during that. But all of a sudden they pick it up and they go da 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 and end something. And you're like, yes, that's it. It's okay to holler. It's okay to say con arte, you have the art. The word tango, again, a lot of linguists and ethnomusicologists have tried to study this because there's no exact connection. The tango argentino is very different from flamenco. It's also, though, a mix of African and European music. There's other musical forms that predate tango, the candombe, the milonga, which is a rhythm that predates tango, and then you get into Argentine tango a little later. Milonga is more of stepping on every beat, like dun, 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 dun. It sounds just like tango, but faster. And you dance every beat. The term milonga also means a lot of different things, but the musical form predates tango a little bit. It is also related to candombe, which is also related to our present day cumbia. And dance steps to milonga, you can actually dance them to cumbia. It's really fun. I go to a lot of tango events, so I like to do that. But the word, many people believe it has African origins, and it in some of the tango books I've read, it means to touch. And tango is a dance where you're touching each other. That's the Argentine side. In flamenco, we're not quite sure, but tangos flamenco is 4 beats per measure. Other songs in flamenco are 12 beats per measure. And Sigüería is a 12 beat per measure. Bulería, Soleá, these are all 12 beats. And they're accented differently depending on the song. However, tangos is one of the more recognizable rhythms because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Rumba, when you hear the Gypsy Kings, is a very sped up tango flamenco. 1, 2, 3, 4, boom, chicka, check, check, like that. But what the word actually means in flamenco, I need to do further research because tangueros seem to think it comes from tocar, to touch, tang, and then there's the go, but it was a different word originally. But that doesn't seem to fit in the form that's done in flamenco. But interestingly, milonga during the 20s, milonga got adopted again as an ida y vuelta into the flamenco family. So there is a version of flamenco cante or song called a milonga, and milonga flamenca, but it's very hard to actually dance Argentine milonga to a milonga flamenca.
Okay. The next question is, did the Lacando songs have coordinated dances such as flamenco?
Which ones?
Did the Lacando songs have coordinated dances such as flamenco?
That one I'm not sure because flamenco is mostly improvisation unless you're doing a big festival or show. So being a folk dance, you learn, it's like you're learning an alphabet and you're learning the basics of a language. And then you're learning how to use that. And one of the differences, I think, with many social dances and folkloric dances is you're going with a set of music that has, in classical Spanish dance too, coplas are a certain length and a certain number of verses. And you know you're dancing to those. Whereas flamenco, the cante or the singing originated first, then the music followed, and the dance and guitar come in. The guitar is actually a latecomer to flamenco, a 19th century latecomer, but the cante and the song came before. But today in flamenco, it's the dancer through improvisation that you command the guitarist and the singer to follow you. So you give them clues as you do a marcaje, or you're marking to the singing. You do what's called a llamada, or a call, that either lets the singer know to come in or to let the guitarist know to come in with what's called a falsetta, which is a musical section. But largely it's a solo dance unless you're in a community setting. The more folkloric dances are with partners, but most of flamenco is a solo dancer and you're telling the people around you what to do. Like with the palmas also, if you're dancing to the singer, usually the palmas are called sordas, but when it's no singing and you're starting to pick up a little bit, do my footwork, the palmas go right with you and they're called claras, and they can get louder as you kind of crescendo up in the dance itself.
Okay,
So
the person who asked that question said, oops, I meant Ladino songs.
Oh, Ladino songs. Yeah, different than flamenco. Obviously way back heritage roots. Some of the language might cross over. Flamenco, obviously Romani is one of the languages that the Gypsies speak in Spain that has some relation to Ladino way back as well. But flamenco, the dialect is pretty much Andalusian Spanish, which sometimes doesn't sound like Spanish at all. It's very hard to understand. They chop off a lot of words. Depending on what town you're in, it's harder to understand. But yeah, roots way back, there is a relation, but musical form is very different today because I haven't heard of anybody dancing flamenco to Ladino music. You probably could, because a lot of dancers like to experiment and do all kinds of different things.
Yeah. Two last comments. One, fantastic Zoom topic, wonderful program and slides.
Thank
And
you.
ole, gracias, Nicolasa.
Gracias a todos. Thanks to all of you for coming, and I love
So-
sharing this history. So
Yes, so thank you very much. Let me just wrap up with a couple of quick announcements. First of all, Nicolasa kindly agreed to let us record this, so we hope to have some editing done. And the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society has a dedicated YouTube channel, so stay tuned. We'll let others know that it will be available. And we have, if you're not a member of the Jewish Historical Society, we have a couple of upcoming programs. We're co-sponsoring with the Texas Jewish Historical Society. The film, it'll be shown virtually, Between the Flower and the Stone, The Duality of Conversos. That'll be in March and April. Jewish New Mexico Military History with my colleague Naomi Sandweiss, co-president. And then our annual business meeting in June. And our speaker will be Rob Martinez, the state historian of New Mexico, who will talk about the Spanish Inquisition in New Mexico. So we have some great upcoming programs. We'll be sending e-blasts as we go along. And if you're not a member of our historical society, check us out. We always like to have new members. So Nicolasa, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
you.
And
Thank
everyone for joining us tonight.
Have
Have a good
wonderful
evening.
night and happy Valentine's Day on Friday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.